Today she is going to talk to us about acquisition versus learning in 2021. Please help me welcome Karen.
Okay, so thank you so much for having me. This is my first post-COVID talk. So it is a weird and good experience to actually be in a room with people who care about second language acquisition, as all of you do. So just to tell you a little bit about myself, I'm originally from Alfred, New York, so very close to here. I love Ithaca. I spent a summer here once when I was, I guess, teaching middle school back in the early 2000s. So I'm from Alfred. I studied at the University of Illinois. I taught middle school. These are my real middle school students who are probably like 30 now. And that is how I got involved in second language acquisition, was through Spanish teaching and hearing about, Stephen Krashen and language acquisition. And let me tell you, it really improved my teaching to know about that. This is me with some pre-service teachers in Illinois. And my research is often on kids that are about kindergarten age, because that's sort of a magical time for language learning. And then lastly, my daughter Phoebe in the middle is 2, and so she has all kinds of interesting language acquisition things going on now. So just a little bit about me. Okay, so the title was Acquisition versus Learning in 2021. And since I'm sure you all have a great deal of training in language teaching, you might think, isn't that outdated, acquisition versus learning? Because it comes from the 70s and 80s. Stephen Krashen was articulating these ideas about language learning. The most widely cited book is this 1982 book. And so yes, I would say the term acquisition versus learning is a little outdated. However, I don't know why it's showing that. Hang on. Okay, there we go. Bill Van Patten and I wrote an article recently in Foreign Language Annals called "Was Krashen Right 40 Years Later?" taking some of his work and then seeing how that work is reflected in modern linguistics and second language acquisition research. And we believe that even though these terms are considered outdated, if you look at language research today, it's actually the exact same ideas, just using different terminology. So in particular, the one that we're going to be focusing on the most today is Krashen's term of acquisition. Today is called implicit learning, and his term of language learning is called explicit learning. And these are huge. Like, there are entire conferences devoted to implicit and explicit learning in second language acquisition. We also wrote a little bit about how what Krashen called a natural order today would be called ordered development, and what Krashen called I+1, which was really criticized a lot because it wasn't well defined. Today we would just say we're trying to give learners communicatively embedded comprehensible input. Okay. So as I said, implicit and explicit language learning are huge. These are, 4 different books spanning years and years and years of focusing on implicit and explicit learning. And if you look at the definitions of implicit learning, where it's that you're just sort of hearing language and processing it using language processing mechanisms and comprehending messages, not trying to consciously learn anything. It's much more similar to how my daughter learns language, which let me tell you, she does not make a goal-directed effort to do virtually anything. So she's just sort of picking it up by hearing it. And explicit learning is more what we do in school. Like, here's this vocabulary, study it, learn it. Here's this grammar rule. We're going to test you on accuracy. If you look at those definitions and the original definitions of acquisition and learning, they're pretty much identical. So what I research has to do with age differences in second language acquisition. So why do these 5 to 7-year-old kids, supposedly have this magical language learning capability? And so I look at internal factors, so cognitive factors, and that's what people traditionally have thought makes the most difference. But I also look more at the external environmental factors like instruction. So what kind of language instruction are they getting? And one common explanation for why kids are good language learners is that they have a better capacity for implicit learning. So, adults are thought to monitor their language more heavily, to, be worried about making mistakes, and kids are more willing to just sort of be immersed in it and pick it up. So this is commonly given as a reason why adults have trouble learning foreign languages. And because of that, a lot of people think that for adults, explicit grammar instruction is superior to implicit instruction. So it's either more effective or it's just more efficient. We can tell them to learn this and they learn it. So for those of you who teach basic level language courses here, is there a lot of grammar instruction that the students get? So? What kind of grammar type activities do you do? What's that? Conjugating, yes, exactly. Right, so that's not something you would do learning your native language, but learning your second language, it is sort of a shortcut to being able to produce more language. Okay, so to give you sort of a preview of the findings, what I find is that people who have had explicit grammar instruction learn differently. So the students that have done that conjugation, that changes the way that they approach the language learning task. So they see it as, a problem to solve, like a thing to get right. And that changes the way they go about it, both in good ways and bad ways. All right, so I'm going to share 3 studies with you that all have really applicable teaching applications. The first one is on elementary age kids learning Spanish. The second one is children and adults, which means college students, in the laboratory. And then the third one is a much more recent study that happened right in the middle of COVID. So no one has seen this one before. Okay. So this study I chose because this is sort of a pseudo-longitudinal study. The kids in this study were 3rd, 4th, 5th, and 6th graders, all in the same Spanish program. So they were at an American private school, and they got primarily TPR storytelling instruction. Have people heard of TPR storytelling? So it's a technique where the teacher makes up a story with the students, and it allows you to speak in the target language with beginners because you all know what you're talking about. So, okay, here's this character, is it a boy? Is it a girl? Is it a crocodile? And so because you have this shared context, you can sort of get away with speaking the target language really early on. So that is the kind of instruction that they got. And then there were 2 comparison groups. So these were both high school groups, and one of them got the same instruction. So that's the adolescent implicit group, and one of them got very different instruction, grammar teaching. I tested all of them for proficiency. So this is using verbal density, how many verbs per sentence, lexical complexity, how much different vocabulary did they use, accuracy, and then words per minute. And they all came out similar on average, although that you can see that the child group had the most words per minute, whereas the group with grammar teaching was the most accurate. So we're going to see that, there are pluses and minuses to all these different teaching methods. And the children's proficiency did increase throughout the program. So no matter what you look at, if you look at 3rd grade, 4th grade, 5th grade, and 6th grade, it goes up. So that's good, they're learning. All right. So for this study, we looked at Spanish verb agreement, so just verb conjugation. But this is something that learners do actually master, as opposed to gender, which I still make mistakes with. Verb agreement would be something that the students do master eventually. And they did 2 tasks. So one task was designed to tap more implicit knowledge, so not to focus them on accuracy. And they had to listen to this story twice and rewrite it based on pictures. So yeah, I don't know how well the audio is going to work, but I will play one recording for you. Okay, so un gato y un perro viven en una casa en Florida. That was like the beginning of the story. And then they had to watch the whole thing a few times and then try to recall it. So because they had to see it a few times, they can't just directly memorize every word, but they have to be able to sort of reproduce the story. Okay, so the explicit task was verb conjugation, and there was a little introduction for those of them that weren't familiar with it. So they just had to conjugate verbs to fit in blanks, and the right answers to this were exactly the same as the verbs that were in that story. So they had to do the same task, just under 2 completely different conditions. One was recall the story, and the other one was just get these words correct. Okay, so the blue bar is the story task and the green bar is the verb conjugation task. And the kids who primarily had this storytelling type instruction, they do better on the story task, which is what we would predict. That's what they have experience with. That's the conditions that they're used to learning with. Same with the high school students who also got this storytelling instruction. And then the grammar class was more accurate overall, and they were better with the verb conjugation than the story. So that's kind of the big picture results. But then if you look at the kids by grade, you will see that one of these things is not like the other. So the 3 younger groups all did better on the story task, and the last group did better on the verb conjugation task. Okay. What happened here? Did they suddenly hit 11 years old and cognitively mature so that now they have this adult-like pattern? Turns out, no. The class has changed. So anytime you're studying natural language learners, you don't control the instruction, you just measure what's there. And so they had longer classes with more form-focused instruction in the 6th grade. Okay. But what this is going to show you is that it's actually sort of even more complex and subtle than just doing better on one task or doing better on another task. So there were also regular and irregular verbs in the tasks. So for instance, this is the group that got grammar instruction. They did better on regular than irregular verbs. And I guess the difference between regular verbs was more pronounced between the 2 tasks than the difference between irregular verbs. So you can see, these 2 patterns are the same and that one's totally different. And it has to do with, did they have an easier time with the irregular verbs or the regular verbs? Okay. If you look at the 3rd, 4th, and 5th graders, and then the 6th graders, you find the exact same patterns. So these kids all do better on the story task, and the kind of verbs, doesn't make that much difference. Whereas the 6th graders, all of a sudden, they do great on the verb conjugation task with regular verbs, because those are the easy rules to apply, and then have more trouble with those on the story task. So this is, not something I expected to find, but just shows you that once they get that explicit grammar instruction, something changes about the way they're doing the tasks. Okay. So because this was a private school, it was not the case that every child in the grade was just there by age. There was sort of a range of ages where some of the kids were a little older, some were a little younger. And so we were able to correlate the age and grade at the test with their performance. So what you see here is that the grade has higher correlations than the age. So, you know, you could say those kids mature later maybe, but it really does seem like the instruction is what's driving this change. So this is taking kids sort of at that point where they're becoming more adult-like learners and saying, okay, is it what class they're in, or is it just what their brain is doing to mature? And it looks like it's more the case what class they're in. So yeah, so grade at the test was the biggest factor. Okay, so teaching implications. All right, once your students have a strong base of proficiency that is gained through, you know, using the language, comprehensible input, reading, listening, you know, once they can handle the language a little bit, then they can become more accurate by learning grammar rules. So if we go back to this slide, you know, the total accuracy goes way up when they study the grammar rules. So, you know, this is actually supporting what they did in that 6th grade class, which is the kids were ready to get some explicit instruction on top of that good base that they had. Okay, however, grammar instruction also works quickly. So they did not need to spend 4 years studying verb conjugation to get there. They were able to, you know, just use the language in class, do, you know, songs, stories, games, all the things that kids do in language classes for years. And then if they're ready for it, the grammar works really fast. So this means you do not have to devote all your classes to the grammar preparation, but it's okay to save it for the end of the sequence. Okay, so that is the first study. I don't know if there are intermediate questions or if we want to save them all for the end, or. Okay, let's keep going. All right. Okay, so that study was on kids. And you might have noticed that there was not a group of kids that got explicit grammar instruction, and that's because I couldn't find any, because, you know, child language courses are just not like that. So for this study, I wanted to have all the comparison groups. And that is why I brought people into the lab. So this was learning an artificial mini language. The mini language is called Sillyspeak. And so it was represented by some toys because there are kids involved. And the adults got to do exactly what the kids got to do, except the kids got prizes such as Lego figurines and little stuffed animals, and the adults got money because that's what motivates kids and that's what motivates adults. So each toy had its own little Sillyspeak word, like this is Nerk, and that's Fairluca, and I used to know all 12 of them really fast, but not anymore. Okay, so there's this little mini language, and that means that no one's ever heard it before. You know, there are no classes on this. You don't hear it on the radio when you go home. It's just in the course of the study. Okay, so the kids had to, and the adults had to act out sentences with the toys and then repeat the sentences. So in this case, this sentence is Mert Nerkpo, and that means moves, like this sort of moves back and forth, frog, the. So it's kind of different than English and Spanish in the word order. And this sentence is Prag Dilba Ka Melnag Ka, which is the man goes into the car, or specifically, go inside, man the, car the. So it's designed to be different from the languages that the students would have studied. Okay, so this one, like I said, I wanted to have all the possible groups. So we have kids split into an implicit training and an explicit training, and then adults also split into an implicit training and an explicit training. And this study took place over the course of 7 days. And you'll see that the main difference between the implicit training group and the explicit training group is the rules. So these kids studied the grammar rules each day, and these adults, and these participants only repeated the sentences. They never learned the rules at all. This is how the grammar rules were taught. So the first one is about the word order. And so when you want to say that a toy did an action, you say the action first, and then you say the toy. And then the other one is grammatical gender. So po was like the feminine gender, and ka was the masculine gender, and that's on the articles, like the word the. Okay. So yeah, verb, subject, object, word order, and also gender marking on articles. Okay, so then on the last day, they did a variety of different tests to try to see, you know, could they produce the language? Could they judge the language? And also, did they know those grammar rules? So had they guessed them if they were never taught them, or did they learn them if they were supposed to learn them? Okay. We're going to look at accuracy first. So this is how accurately were they able to say those sentences like nerk po. So the child implicit group was about 65% accurate. The explicit group a little more. The adult implicit group a little more, and the adult explicit group was the most accurate. So even though for each age group, the ones that learn the grammar rules are a little more accurate, that actually doesn't come out as significant. So what you have is that the adults are more accurate than the children. Adults are just better at stuff, especially in the early days of language learning. But you know, if you've ever tried to get a child to put on their coat, you know how long it takes them versus how long it takes an adult. So this whole idea of kids as magic language learners, that is a long-term magic. It is not a short-term magic. So the adults were more accurate than the children. There was no effective training condition and no interactions. Okay, so right here, we have a different teaching implication than the other study. Teaching grammar rules does not make students significantly more accurate in this case. Any ideas for why they came out differently? Yeah, I think length of study is a big part. So remember, when the kids had the grammar instruction, they'd already had years of exposure to the language, whereas this is just a very brief, 7-day laboratory-based study. These people were not ready to learn grammar rules, and so, maybe they weren't as helpful. So yeah, in this case, it did make them a tiny bit more accurate, but not significant. So did not really help for these beginners to do the grammar rules. Okay. Next, we looked at fluency. So we wanted to see if either of the groups could say the sentences more smoothly. And I am going to play these sound files. I'm going to stop talking and just play the sound files so I don't get a bunch of feedback. But we looked at the whole sentence, so mert nagra po. And we also looked at this pause, which is in between the noun and the article. Okay, so yeah, so when the people are fluent, you get them saying the sentences very quickly. So like mert nagra po, like no pauses. For the people who are thinking about it, you'll get mert nagra po, which is really quite a long pause if you're just having a conversation with that person. And then for the kids, you can hear that A, there's chaos in the background, which is totally normal for school. And B, they're like, Ferluka po, no, wait, that's not it. Let's see, ladnaka, ladnaka. So there can be like a lot of hesitation and thinking. All right. So let's see how they did with the fluency. All right. So this is how long it took people to say sentences. So we have about 3 seconds for the adult implicit group, so the one that did not study the grammar rules. And then 4 seconds for the ones who did. 5 seconds for the children. Again, children are just slow. That's how they are. They talk slower. And 6 seconds for the child explicit group. So here, oops, you are getting a significant effective age. Adults speak faster. You're also getting a significant effective training. And again, no interactions. So the kids and adults respond the same way. They're not different animals. They're sort of experiencing the conditions the same way. Okay. All right. So this was actually even stronger with the pause times. So the adults who studied grammar rules paused for about twice as long as the ones that didn't. And it was the same for the kids. So this is like really surprising that kids and adults would perform the same on just about anything. So we have no significant effective age, just an effect of training. So the ones who studied the grammar rules were more hesitant when they had to say the sentences. Okay, so teaching implications. In this case, teaching grammar rules does not make students significantly more accurate, but it does make them significantly less fluent. And this is actually kind of a big deal because, language researchers have been saying for a long time that, we shouldn't focus so much on grammar rules, but there hasn't really been a lot of evidence about why. And I would say that's because people don't usually measure fluency. Like, this is very time consuming to measure those sentences, and accuracy is really fast. You just, it's right or wrong. So there has not been a lot of research where people look at the student's fluency. Okay. The participants were also debriefed to see how well they understood what was going on. So this would be someone who has no idea what's going on. Why do you think it's Fumpoga Po and not Fumpoga Ka? Because he's a parrot. The really cool thing is that the kids always answer, even if they have no idea. They can come up with some explanation. And then this is a person who noticed the rules but did not understand them. So this person said, some of them have po at the end of them and some of them have ka at the end of them. And I don't really know why, but I noticed that this was part of the study. And then somebody who understood the rules would say, the po is girls and the ka is boys. You say the action first and then you say the toy. Okay, so we're gonna see who figured out the rules or who learned them. All right, this is the kids that were not shown the rules. So like 14 of them, no clue, blissfully unaware. 6 of them started to notice the po and ka. The ones that were taught the rules, 17 out of 20 knew the rules. They knew what they were supposed to be learning. Okay, this is where it gets really different. So the adults, 8 of them figured out the rules. We never told them. So they could say on the last day, these are the 2 grammar rules of the study. And then the rest all noticed it. So none of the adults were blissfully unaware of grammar. And the adults who were taught rules that were simple enough for 5-year-old children for 5 days, they did in fact learn them. So that's good. Okay, so this is age group is significant, instruction condition is significant, and again, there's no interaction, so they respond to the condition the same way. It's just that the kids are down here in understanding and the adults are up here in understanding. Okay. So as far as teaching implications, teaching grammar rules makes your students significantly slower, but not significantly more accurate. And Teaching grammar rules makes students develop explicit knowledge of grammar rules. So there was a very clear measurable effect that they developed this, meta-linguistic understanding of the language. Okay. All right. So the third study that I'm going to share with you is going back to the natural classroom again. So using real learners in real intact classes, not in a laboratory setting, because, 7 days of instruction is 7 days of instruction. None of us teach like that. We all teach for years of instruction. We hope the students will continue for years. So this project was initiated by Barb Watson, who is a high school teacher. She's one of the teachers in the study. And there were 2 sections of students that got this TPR storytelling and one of traditional in the same high school. And we actually had a variety of different tests and measures planned for the end of the study, but this was done in spring 2020. And so COVID happened right before the final data collection. So they ended up doing a simulated conversation by video. I don't know if anyone's ever used this in your classes, but you ask a question and then you sort of leave a pause on the recording so that the student has a chance to answer. And it's sort of like a controlled way to see how they answer questions. But, because it's a recording, they might do it again. They might, read their answers. There's different things that can go wrong with that. All right. So yes, I talked about this a little bit earlier. This is a book or a module that I wrote about it. But TPR storytelling is the kind of instruction that I use for these implicit groups because A, it's really well defined, and B, it is kind of one of the only teaching methods that tries to focus on the language exposure and not go into the grammar practice. So we talked about that TPRS uses the co-construction of a story with students. It's done in the target language. It uses high frequency vocabulary. So like the most common words in any language will be, to have, to want, to go, that kind of stuff. And then it provides lots of input in the target language with small amounts of translation for clarity. In contrast, more traditional teaching would be the use of a grammar-based syllabus and textbook. So, there's indirect object pronouns in this chapter, and there's irregular verbs in that chapter. Exercises demanding student output and grammatical accuracy, and teaching a larger set of vocabulary. So you might learn like 20 foods, whereas this method would sort of focus on the word eat and like not worry so much about the long list of foods. So they are very different. Okay. And it is sort of a more implicit kind of teaching. It's also described as comprehensible input or communicatively embedded comprehensible input. TPRS is a kind of comprehensible input though, the way that Kleenex is a kind of tissues, like it's almost synonymous with, if you do comprehensible input, you at least know about TPRS, even if that's not what you're doing. So it is sort of the people who brought this idea to the mainstream. Okay. So as I said, the students did simulated conversations at the end of the year. And what we did to rate those conversations was not, count the words or measure the vocabulary, all those really detailed measures. We just did a global ACTFL proficiency rating. So I don't know if you guys have proficiency targets here for your classes, but this is novice mid, novice high, intermediate low, and intermediate mid. And it was on this simulated conversation. So it was on things that they had sort of practiced in class, more of a performance assessment, not like a true proficiency assessment, but going in that direction. And this is my RA, Nathan, who just finished doing these videos and class recordings. So I would like to thank him. Okay, so this is at the end of a year of Spanish 1. And the students were doing really well. You know, on this particular performance task, they were hitting like an ACTFL intermediate low level, which is pretty good for 1 year. But what we were hoping for is that there would be some advantage of one kind of teaching over another, and that is not what we got. What we got is that the two classes were the same. So this is the percentage of students at each level. The blue ones are the storytelling classes, and the orange ones are the traditional classes. So, okay, maybe the TPRS classes were like slightly higher, not significant. We say they perform the same. So the type of teaching method here did not make a difference for how the students performed at the end of the year. Okay, so teaching implications of this new one. First of all, COVID-19 was highly disruptive. You know, not just to students and teachers and language classes and schools and the whole world, but also to research and data collection. So, you know, the study was what it was. We can say, based on this, that the comprehensible input-based curriculum did perform just as well as the grammar-based curriculum on this task. There have been other studies that have used like more traditional tests to measure it. You know, this is just what we ended up doing, but we can say that the classes performed equally. Okay. So in summary, and I guess we're a little ahead of time. I'm probably too fast now that I'm out of practice of giving in-person talks. My recommendation, as far as, you know, people are always interested in, so what does this research have to say for language teaching? 2 of the studies were done in classrooms, 1 was done in the lab. All the results are different, okay? How can we draw some sort of summary recommendations from this? I would say, get your students as much comprehensible input as possible, especially at the beginning of classes. So make them read and listen to lots and lots of easy materials. If you're going to focus on grammar, it's better to do it a little bit later. I had this experience not with explicit grammar instruction, but with explicit pronunciation instruction in a Chinese course. So it was, I think, a 2-week course, like over winter study. And the teacher taught us what the possible beginnings and what the possible ends of Chinese syllables were, but we didn't know any vocabulary. So we knew what the phonotactic rules of the language were without having any vocabulary to hang it on. So yes, I think, you know, it would have benefited me more had I learned some vocabulary and then learned what the possible rules were. Okay, why is this what I feel like is our goal? First of all, it'll improve student fluency. So fluency, I think, has been really, really underemphasized, you know, both in research and in language classes. The more that you do written tests as the main measure, you know, students can think and they could like take their time on those. When you have a conversation, it has to go fast. So students usually, if you say, you know, what do you want to get out of language classes? They'll say, I want to speak the language, like I want to be able to have a conversation. That requires fluency-oriented activities. The comprehensible input students also perform as well as traditional students in the last study. So there's not a big detriment to sort of holding off on the grammar. And we also saw that grammar instruction works quickly. So one of the metaphors that I sometimes use is like, if you are training for a race, getting out there and running some miles is the way that you really build up your fitness. Now you can also go take steroids, and that will also help, that'll help you very fast. But it's not the same as the everyday practice, 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 you know, use the language, use the language, use the language. It's sort of a shortcut. Okay, So whether you call it acquisition, which is what Krashen called it way back when, or implicit learning, which is just learning from exposure, processing lots of input is the way that language gets in your brain in a way that it can be accessed and used fluently. So if you think back to the first study where the story task was time pressured because the students had to listen to it and then rewrite it. That's how you tap the implicit knowledge, is doing things with time pressure, whereas the explicit knowledge is tapped with tasks that people can take their time and think about. Okay, and that is what I have. So I'm happy for questions and discussion, and thank you so much for inviting me in person to do a thing. No, I've never done the, pre-test, post-test, delayed post-test treatment. I guess with the longer studies where the students had a whole year of class, you can sort of consider that that is the post-test. And I've always been really interested in trying to test students at the end of the school year, and then again after the summer, to see, are they able to retain what they've learned? You would expect some sort of advantage for comprehensible input-based teaching in the retention. No one has done that. So yeah, so your question, absolutely, all of these studies would benefit from a delayed post-test. Okay, so fossilized errors. I would say if students have fossilized errors, that means that they've been exposed repeatedly to the wrong forms. So the way that I would fix that is by lots of exposure to the right forms. I don't know very much about Korean, so I can't come up with a good example, but for instance, if they are doing the pronouns wrong or doing the verbs wrong, you would want to focus on sort of like an input flood where they would get lots of exposure to that. I would also say for fossilized errors like that, that is a place where I think explicit grammar instruction can help, say this, not this. But yeah, that's really interesting that through self-study, you feel like that they did develop those fossilized errors because, they're getting a lot of language exposure and maybe not noticing like what the details are of the form. So that would be a place where they have the fluency. So that would mean that they're ready to have more grammar instruction like the first group of students. I would say that is, if you're showing them examples of a specific thing and saying, find the pattern, I would put that in the explicit category, but it is still input because they're seeing the forms. And humans are great at finding patterns. So that is something that humans can do, not just in language, but they can do it with, video games, or they can do it with predicting the weather, or they can do it with, humans are good pattern finders. And adults are really good pattern finders, especially if you tell them to look for it. So yeah, I would say there is a big continuum. When I'm doing research, I'm deliberately trying to have them be quite different because I want to see what the difference is, and that's easier to see when there's a big difference. But in your class, you might have something that's totally implicit. You might have something that's mostly implicit. So say you're doing an input flood on, reflexive verbs. So there's a ton of reflexive verbs in there, and some students know that's what the activity is about, and other students don't. So yeah, I agree that there is a continuum between sort of more implicit and more explicit. And if you go back to, let's say, the very first study had some of these design features. So this is like Ellis 2005 design features. To be the most implicit, you would want to use field rather than rules, have it be time pressured, does not require metalinguistic knowledge, focused on meaning, not focused on form. And you would also want it to be totally spoken. So I used like 4 out of the 5 of those. And then for explicit tasks, you want it to be written, encourage rule use, unpressured, untimed, requires metalinguistic knowledge, and it's focused on form. So yeah, I absolutely agree that, if you take these 5 things, you could have 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5 of them. And that could be the continuum that you're talking about between the different kinds of teaching. So the question is, what if what the language learners expect is, drill, grammar practice, correctness? Yeah, and that is, you're getting course evaluations. I would say telling students, we're reading this book because the way that you learn, Spanish syntax is by seeing how lots and lots and lots of sentences, like think about how many books you've read in your first language. You need more exposure to it in your second language, and sort of explaining like, for this activity, this is a conversation activity. Don't worry about getting it perfect. Like you want to be fast for this activity. For another activity, maybe you focus on accuracy. So I think kind of letting students know a little bit about second language acquisition. So even for middle school kids, I will try to, tell them that listening is really important for learning a language. So, if I'm speaking Spanish and you're not listening, then like you're not learning it, which, serves multiple purposes. But I think telling your students, what the goals are, making sure that your assessments are aligned with the class. So a lot of times classes get more communicative, where we're like, talking about each other's lives. And then on the exam, there's still a bunch of grammar questions. Well, students are not going to be happy with that. So, if the exam is write about your life, speak about your life, and they feel like the class is directly preparing them for that, then you're less likely to get those kind of comments. But yeah, totally agree. If people have learned language this way in the past, and I think that's actually what's going on with these adults who are able to, magically guess the language rules, is they've had foreign language classes before, and they know there are rules, and they know that there's like a pattern to be discovered, like you said. So these people in this study were limited to 2 years of prior language study, and other studies haven't done that. They've had people in them with 5 years, 10 years of language study. Yeah, of course those people know that there are going to be grammar rules. So yeah, once they've had that experience, then they may continue to expect that. The other thing that I think is good for explaining it is the fluency focus. So, okay, we can study grammar rules, but if we study grammar rules, you're going to be more hesitant because you're going through that rule in your mind. Okay, how do I apply the rule? Is this a regular or irregular verb? What's the person? What's the tense? That all takes time. And because, we have finite brain power, we need to, either focus it on fluency or accuracy. It's hard to do both simultaneously. It's, be fast and accurate. Yeah, of course, we want them to be fast and accurate, but, saying this activity is for fluency, I think can help. Okay, so the question is, these are sort of all on Romance languagey type agreements, so either verb agreement or, gender agreement. So what would it be like if there was something more semantically based? So, I do Spanish, there's 2 past tenses. One is sort of more ongoing, one is more like one event. So that's very semantic. And I would say, people have looked at this. They've looked at rule complexity and how easy it is to explicitly explain the rule. Everything that we explain in language class is just a heuristic. So that's not like what language is really doing. That's just like the way that we're simplifying it to a level where students can maybe understand. So we're not explaining the real true grammar. We're explaining, tricks to get close to it. I would say it should be similar. I think people who have studied rule complexity and looked at how the learners learned it, have not found that one kind of teaching or the other kind of teaching is a lot better. What you would expect to find, just conceptually, is, okay, if the rule is really complex and semantic, then implicit instruction where they're just getting exposed to it would be better because we can't really characterize it verbally. I don't think that's what people have found. So yes, these are very, agreement type things. I should mention that I always study beginners because when you're looking for people who have never been exposed to X, the longer they're exposed, the more they're definitely going to have been exposed to X. So, I study beginners for that reason. Also because if you think about like all the language learners in the world, the biggest group is beginners. So yeah, so I think if we had a more semantic rule, I think you would find something similar, but I have not tested that.